With Marx, we encounter a political philosopher who had an unusually direct effect on the political development of his own society. Not many philosophers give rise to linked political and intellectual movements that actually change the course of history. Marx did. He stands at the head of a complex tradition anchored in both theory and practice, a philosophy that has influenced the politics and culture of every society that has undergone the wrenching process of capitalist industrialization. Yet, as Marx himself famously said, I am no Marxist. All philosophers who leave a school of followers in their wake find themselves in the same vexing position. To be a great philosopher requires insight and originality. But once one becomes a figurehead, a symbol of a movement that is inspired by, but bigger than, its founding thinker, originality is sacrificed for consistency, and insight for dogma. Marx suffered this peculiar philosopher's fate to an unusual extent. Even now, he is regularly held to account for the problems of the world, often by right-wing commentators who have spent more than a century turning a German philosopher into a human devil. More difficult still is the legacy of the regimes that have claimed Marx as an inspiration, which became notorious for their intensive use of state violence to advance revolutionary projects derived from Marx's thought. But Marx is also a founder of the social sciences as a form of scholarly inquiry. Marx's works define some of the conceptual foundations for studies in sociology, political science, history, anthropology, and economics. In each field, assumptions about the material basis of social life and the dynamics of class society can be traced to Marx's thought. While for Marx, his political views flow naturally from his philosophical claims, for us it is nevertheless possible to reject Marx's politics while adopting his intellectual tools to analyze social developments in history. In many ways, Marx can be seen as the culminating thinker of the Enlightenment tradition. He was certainly its most sophisticated exponent of materialism. In fact, the correct term for Marxism as a philosophy is historical materialism. This term highlights Marx's central premise. To understand how and why human societies develop in the ways they do, we must center our attention on the material conditions of those societies' existence. How do different societies produce their means of existence? How do they organize this necessary labor? How are the benefits of production distributed? How is structural exploitation enforced and justified? When these questions are investigated, certain patterns of economic and political life emerge, and it becomes possible to identify general historical trends. From the dissonant noise of events, a rhythm of history emerges. Once the rhythm is identified, it becomes possible to make predictions about future developments. From the scholar's perspective, this is just a particular set of tools for probing the nature of social reality. But from other perspectives, it is a program for transforming the world in pursuit of justice. Marx's entire life was immersed in politics. He was from a prosperous bourgeois family in the Rhineland and trained as a scholar in the Hegelian tradition, the massively influential idealist philosophy of Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel that revolutionized German philosophy and set the boundaries of 19th century European thought generally. He traveled in intellectual circles that sought to apply Hegelian ideas to practical politics, which, in the autocratic kingdom of Prussia, was tantamount to treason. Though, in the Prussia of the 19th century, virtually any reform was seen by the authorities as treasonous. Prussia's absolutist monarchy remembered the trauma of the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars, in which foreign conquest was paired with a social revolution from below. Napoleon's defeat was also a defeat for the progressive ideals of the French Revolution, and Marx grew up under the heavy hand of an autocracy that suppressed any hint of democratic reform in defense of the old aristocratic order and its bourgeois capitalist allies. Intellectual life was severely censored, though the state's ability to repress change was often less than effective. For a time, Marx lived in the comparatively freer climate of Paris, where he met his lifelong friend and collaborator Friedrich Engels. He immersed himself in working-class French politics, and it was during this Paris period that he produced his first mature works, so called because they laid out the first version of the concepts he would refine over the course of his life, and that would become the building blocks of Marxist philosophy and politics. The German Ideology is one of these texts, where Marx and Engels sat down an anthropological sketch of humanity's place in nature and its historical consequences. In a sense, the German Ideology is a Marxian version of Hobbes or Rousseau's or Aristotle's outline of human origins. If the classical core of Marxist thought is a critical study of capitalism, here Marx lays down the premises that make that critique possible. Though written in 1845, this work went unpublished until 1930, mostly because the sections on the philosophy of history are surrounded by long, nerdy burns directed at Marx's intellectual rivals. The man could not avoid a polemical fight with his various rivals in the socialist movement, and thank God there was no Twitter in the 1840s. The years following the writing of the German Ideology were tumultuous for Marx. He returned to the Prussian Rhineland and worked as a newspaper editor, repeatedly getting in trouble with the censor. He was working as an editor in the city of Cologne when the revolutions of 1848 broke out and changed the course of his life. Since 1815, reaction and repression had been the rule in post-Napoleonic European regimes. The exceptions were Britain, where political and economic liberalism were bolstered by rapid industrialization and the expansion of capitalism, and France, where a restored monarchy was unable to suppress a turbulent political underground that embodied the radical traditions of the French Revolution. In February 1848, long building popular resentment of the so-called bourgeois monarchy of King Louis Philippe exploded, and revolutionary crowds drove the king from Paris and declared a second republic. As if by a signal, the fall of Louis Philippe triggered a spontaneous wave of revolts across Europe and the rest of the world. In the Rhineland, a revolt against Prussian rule threw the monarchy on its heels, and in Frankfurt, a Congress gathered to write a constitution for a united, liberal Germany. But this Congress failed to agree on a governing structure, and within months, the king rallied aristocrats, landlords, and nervous bourgeois capitalists to renew the counter-revolution. The army was unleashed and violently restored royal authority. This was the pattern in all countries affected by the revolutions of 1848. Brief periods of victory gave room for revolutionaries to experiment with new political and economic reforms, but fractures in the revolutionary coalition made room for counter-revolution to gain ground, and by 1849, the old regimes had been restored everywhere but France, which would decline into dictatorship within 2 years. The revolutionary coalitions were doomed by a split between middle-class, bourgeois forces and working-class, proletarian forces. The bourgeois wanted to abolish all remnants of feudal absolutism and create a modern, constitutional state that guaranteed the stability and freedoms needed to expand the capitalist economy. The proletarians too wanted to abolish the old order, but by 1848, workers had begun to articulate their own revolutionary ideals. More and more, they viewed the freedom offered by bourgeois liberals as an excuse for exploitation, and their revolutionary vision extended to a social republic that would guarantee the essentials of life for all its people in a political system of equality and democracy. In 1848, the rapid paralyzation of existing monarchies encouraged a surge of radicalism, and working-class militants aggressively pursued their interests in ways that threatened the bourgeois leadership of the revolutions. These moderates were interested in restoring order quickly, securing the immediate gains of the revolution, and suppressing any further push for change. In every bourgeois mind lurked the fear of the Jacobin terror and the guillotine. So in response to this fear, the bourgeoisie resorted to a guillotine of its own. In France, in Marx's Rhineland, and elsewhere, bourgeois moderates decided that their proletarian partners were more trouble than they were worth. Bourgeois leaders sided with the resurgent monarchies against working-class radicalism, and the tide of revolution turned. In France, the bourgeois government was confident enough in its own power to rule without inviting back the king, and it won rural and elite support when it turned the army against a working-class revolt in Paris. In the Rhineland, bourgeois moderates looking to save their skins abandoned the revolution and sided with the Prussian king. Middle-class radicals like Marx, who would not submit, either stayed to face trial and punishment at the hands of a vengeful state or escaped abroad. Marx became one of the so-called 48ers, fleeing with his family to London, where he spent the rest of his life working in conditions that ranged from moderate to dire poverty. Throughout his life, Marx struggled financially and relied on the support of his friend Engels, who, as the son of a factory owner, commanded a substantial fortune. Of such bourgeois lives are theories of working-class revolution refined. In the German ideology, Marx frames the outline of an intellectual project that will ultimately conclude in an analysis of the historical development of capitalism and the forces that will revolutionize it and found a classless society of equals. He begins with his first anthropological claim. Humans distinguish themselves from the rest of the animal kingdom once they begin to produce the necessities of life for themselves. For Marx, the unique human quality that determines all others is their instinct for cooperative work to produce and reproduce their material conditions of life. By this, Marx means all the food, water, clothing, shelter, tools, and so on that must be produced day in, day out to keep a society functioning. Individual humans in the wilderness have a limited capacity to reliably supply themselves with these necessities. So Marx takes it for granted that humans become human when they work together and so create a society. Unlike the social contract theorists, who begin with the premise that humans begin life as individuals before they enter society, Marx thinks that humans only begin to develop their unique potentials as humans once they are living and working together. For Marx, the sheer variety observed in historical societies is first of all a result of the different environmental conditions people face. Societies that must adapt to temperate or harsh environments, to river valleys or Arctic wastes, will develop institutions and practices that reflect the needs of life in these environments. Depending on the environmental factors at work, societies will organize their labor forces in ways that try to best adapt to the relevant limits imposed by climate, terrain, and resources. The primal social distinctions between mental and manual labor and rural and urban societies develop at this stage, which in turn shapes the conditions in which the political, economic, and social forms of life develop in these societies. This division of labor is the original sin in Marx's theoretical universe. For Marx, human beings have a unique potential for development, since their apparently singular gifts of reason, language, and technological innovation allow them to outthink nature's limits. This set of potentials allows for the limitless development of the individual, since innate human dexterity allows them to be many different kinds of person and pursue many different forms of satisfaction in the course of their self-development. Think of it like this. For Marx, the ideal human life is one where you can live and work in such a way that everything you do expresses your individual nature. Perhaps you would fish in the morning, raise cattle in the afternoon, and write criticism after dinner. You can do all of these things, as your will dictates, without ever being reduced to a fisherman, or a shepherd, or a critic. The division of labor puts this human goal, this kind of modern telos, out of reach for all but a tiny minority. Because the reproduction of social necessities requires regular, repeated work, the division of labor insists that you only ever be a fisherman, or a shepherd, or a critic. You are what you do, because your labor is necessary for some larger social purpose. This creates a feeling of alienation, a sense of painful separation between the self and the world. After all, if we express our humanity through freely chosen work, how free can we be when we are compelled to work at the behest of others, making their products and realizing their visions? The division of labor necessarily creates hierarchies. It creates social orders in which some rule and many are ruled, and violence is used to manage the exploitation of the labor that keeps society functioning. Since the development of agriculture, writing, and states around 10,000 years ago, complex societies all developed hierarchies in which small ruling groups of mostly warriors and priests dominated and exploited the labor of masses of peasants and workers. The division of labor thus creates class societies, and class societies are defined by conflict. By class, Marx means a group of people defined by the economic role they play in a given system of production. Under the feudal system, for example, the noble ruling class controlled the sources of landed wealth, which were worked by a class of dependent peasants. In modern capitalist societies, the class struggle pits the bourgeoisie, who own the means of production as their private property, against the proletariat, workers who own nothing but their own labor power. In all class societies, the ruling group extracts the productive surplus of the laboring groups. This is how they sustain themselves without doing any of the hard work of necessary social labor. They rule and direct and control the productive system, and so feel themselves entitled to live off its surplus. For the feudal lord, this might be half of his tenants' crops. For the modern bourgeois, it's the profit they realize by paying you less than your labor is worth. Differences in culture are the result of distinct modes of production, and all notable human distinctions are adaptive, not innate. In their essential qualities, motivations, and potentials, all humans are equal. When Marx says, quote, "As individuals express their life, so they are," end quote, he means that we are what we do, and what we do is conditioned by our social environment. This gets to the heart of Marx's materialism. Our individuality is conditioned by our social lives. For Marx, we are only individuals in the context of life with others, in a community. Much of what we think of as our personalities is not the expression of some unique self, but instead habits shaped by the social contexts in which we live our lives. Our consciousness, our sense of being in the world, is a self-perpetuating fantasy we make out of materials furnished by the societies we live in. This means that the ideas we have about life, the world, God, fate, love, and so on are not just self-willed expressions of thought conceived in the brain and then communicated in the world. These ideas, like all aspects of the imagination, are conditioned by our social reality. It follows that by changing the form of social reality, different kinds of human existence can be brought into being. After all, this is what the ruling classes of history have always done. Marx takes it for granted that the ideas of the ruling class are always the dominant ideas of a class society, since these ideas justify a social order that benefits the ruling group. The more sophisticated the class society, the more intensely the rulers indoctrinate the ruled into a way of seeing the world that treats the status quo as natural and desirable. These ideas are reflected in the institutions that govern economic, political, and social life, and ensure the perpetuation of the ruling regime and its allied mode of production. A social revolution, then, is one that overthrows a mode of economic production, and with it its associated political and social practices, in favor of another mode, which in turn supports a new class structure. History is the progressive working out of these class struggles, and Marx argued that history was entering a new phase under the sign of the Industrial Revolution. Marx argued that class societies and their divisions of labor, for all the harm they do, are necessary for societies to survive in a world of scarcity. But the Industrial Revolution, for the first time in history, had created the possibility of overcoming scarcity. Through technological innovation and rationalized production, humans were at last capable of satisfying the material needs of all. In capitalist society, industrial production required the exploitation of the workers, but the growth this exploitation made possible created the economic conditions for abundance produced by free, uncoerced labor. Because the workers, by their work, control a system of production capable of providing for all, they have a duty to overthrow the regime of capitalist private property and liberate this productive capability for the common good. By winning the last class revolution, the proletariat would be in a position to abolish classes altogether, since the means exist to transcend the division of labor and encourage truly free human development. This is the revolutionary vision that results from Marx's understanding of human nature and the innate qualities that make humans what they are.